Now in this video we're going to quickly walk through the basics of creating a thematic or a choropleth map, which basically means that I have some area that I want to represent by a range of values that represent something. So of course the first thing that I need is some data. So from within ArcGIS I'm going to click on the Add Data button and find my data set. Now for this example, what I'm actually using is the New York City Community Health Survey data, which is available. The best way to find it is just by doing an internet search for Community Health Survey GIS data. And what this represents is essentially a whole bunch of health indicators across New York City, and they will all be percentiles. I can take a quick look at my attribute table just to see what's in this data set. If I right click on the layer and click Open Attribute Table, I can essentially browse the entire data set. Now, I'm already familiar with this data set, so I know that ultimately what I'm after is one of these columns. And again, these represent some percent of some health indicator. Now, if I didn't know what one of these variables represented, an easy way to find out is to simply look at the file's metadata. And metadata can be opened directly in ArcGIS by right-clicking on the layer you're interested in, going down to the data option, and clicking View Metadata. Now, all files should have metadata, but not all GIS files do. But if I'm fortunate and I do have metadata, essentially it's going to give me a lot of basic information about the data set that I'm working with. And by clicking on Attributes, I can find the listing of the same columns that I was just looking at in the data table, and perhaps I find something that I'm interested in making a map out of. In this example, I'll use the diabetes variable, diabet2. So here's my definition. So closing the metadata, I can go back here. Now remember, you can rename layers within ArcGIS. You're not actually going to be harming the data or physically otherwise changing the file name. And to do that, I can slowly click on the file name, and I know that this is going to represent my percent of people told of ever having diabetes. Alright, so from here what I really want to do is begin symbolizing my data using that variable that I found. And the easiest way to begin doing that is simply by double-clicking on the layer, making sure I'm on the Symbology tab, and clicking on the Quantities option. Now when I click on the Quantities option, I'll have the opportunity to select the variable that I was interested in, because essentially it's pulling the columns directly from the file. So I find that diabetes variable again here and select it. Now as soon as I do, ArcGIS is going to take my value and divide it into a number of classes, and by default it's going to use a natural breaks or jinx classification or method, and it's going to assign 5 classes. Now for the purpose of this data, what I'm really interested in is quartiles. So to begin, what I'm going to do is change this from 5 to 4 classes, and then click on the Classify button. Now from the classification window, I can select a different method for breaking up my data, and in this case I want the quartile method. When I select it, I'll see for my histogram that my breaks are actually changing, and I still have my 4 classes. Now one thing that I know about this data is it includes some areas that actually don't have any data. These areas are essentially Central Park and the 2 airports, so I want to remove those from consideration for my quartile method. To do that, I click on the Exclusion button. From the Data Exclusion Properties window, I can find my variable again, and since this is something that I'm going to be excluding from consideration when I begin symbolizing my map, I need to find the same variable, select it, and finish building my query. So we can see what it's doing here. Click on the equals button, and if I want to, I can get all unique values for that particular column. And I want to remove 0, so I select it here. I can verify my expression by clicking on the Verify button. And assuming all goes well, I can now click OK, and my histogram has actually readjusted to represent what should be now the correct quantile classification for this particular variable. So, once you're satisfied, go ahead and click OK. Now, while I'm in this Layer Properties window, I'm also going to fix the way that it's labeling my data. Now, you could simply click on these and change them by typing in new values, but another way to do it is by clicking on this label header or this label button, which will let you format the labels. Now again, I already know that these represent percentages, so I'm going to click on percentage, click on numeric options to remove some of the extra decimal places. Leaving 2 or 1 is a good idea. Click OK, click OK, and now this is looking better. So again, if I want to, I can still click on each one of these labels and add additional information or change how the information is being represented. It's not actually changing your range. So that looks pretty good. I'm now going to hit Apply, and if I move my Layer Properties window out of the way, I can begin getting a picture of what's actually happening. Now if that looks good, great. If I want to, I can change my color ramp to something else. Maybe clean up my symbols a little bit, either by individually clicking on them or working on them in a group. And once I'm ready, click OK, and now my map's starting to come together. Now, a reminder, I lost some areas. I had some areas down here and up here and Central Park represented in my original file. Now, I like to include those areas because technically, otherwise the risk is that this begins to look like the coast, and it's not. So, what I can do is go back to my Add Data button, select the layer again, add it in. Remember that it draws in order from the top to bottom, so I'm going to drag this top layer by selecting it, holding down my left button, and simply dragging it below my diabetes ever variable, and maybe changing this color to something more neutral. And now my map has the areas represented, but they're not distracting or otherwise taking away from the message of my map. So that's in essence how I begin building a one variable map. In future videos, what we'll talk about is actually finishing this map, adding a legend, scale bar, north arrow, title, some other things, and also how to add a second variable on top.